Hello, my name is Michelle Evans, and I'm the author of the X-15 rocket plane flying the first wings into space, published by the University of Nebraska Press as part of their Outward Odyssey, the People's History of Spaceflight series. It's an honor to be speaking to you at Aerospace 2021 in Valencia, Spain. I wish I could be there in your beautiful city in person, but I hope that you will enjoy my virtual talk today. My presentation will be a bit different than many of the programs you will see as part of this conference, in that it deals with the most successful experimental rocket plane that ever took to the skies, but also, more importantly, about the men who flew the first wings into space. I hope that this story will inspire and inform with regard to the future direction of flight testing. Here is a short excerpt from the beginning of Chapter 5 of my book. Eons of hot, dry sun baked the ancient lake bottom to near asphalt hardness, the color bleached to a dirty white. Close up, the surface was crisscrossed with fissures, giving it the look of dragon scales. Seasonal rain repeatedly scoured the top layer smooth. Roughly circular, the dry lake was more than 5 miles across, a perfect oasis of level ground among the scattered hills surrounding the area. Southeast of the silver boomtown from the early 1900s of Tonopah, Nevada, the lake was given the inauspicious name of Mud. No vegetation marred the pristine surface. Maybe an occasional lizard, snake, jackrabbit, or coyote might dart across the outer edges, but there was little reason for any living thing to trek across the vastness of that silent interior. All these inhospitable qualities were perfect for one special purpose. On the morning of 9 November 1962, that purpose was fulfilled as the quiet was shattered by a sonic boom. The X-15 with pilot Jack McKay at the controls had not achieved full thrust after launch, so he needed a place to land. Mud Dry Lake was directly to the east of his flight track. He turned and made for the ground. As he neared touchdown, McKay set the flaps, but they did not respond. His landing was going to be very fast. The rear skids slapped down, followed quickly by the nose gear. Bouncing slightly, the left rear skid failed under the strain. A chain reaction began as the now crippled aircraft went out of control. The left wing and rear stabilizers scraped along the ground, ripping the stabilizer from its mount. The wing continued to slide, pivoting the aircraft, then flipping the X-15 onto its back. As the accident unfolded for McKay, time slowed as adrenaline kicked in, heightening his test pilot reflexes. Jack sensed the beginning of the flip, instinctively reaching for the canopy jettison switch. He knew if the aircraft went over, he would be trapped inside if it remained in place. The aircraft came to rest on its back as McKay had feared, but with the canopy now gone, the weight of the aircraft now transferred directly to Jack's helmet, compressing his neck. A helicopter moved in, using its downwash to keep the area clear of fumes from the toxic fuels aboard the stricken rocket plane. It took 9 years to achieve Mach 1, Mach 2, and finally Mach 3. The last of these cost the life of pilot Mel Abt. Gaining speed was a dangerous business. Yet a winged rocket ship which could double those records in a few short years went into development, the X-15 rocket plane. Now, Scott Crossfield left the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics to work for North American Aviation to help design, build, and fly the X-15. Scott is seen here with the chief pilots for the NACA and the U.S. Air Force, Joe Walker and Ivan Kinchlow. Now you can see construction at the North American Aviation facilities near Los Angeles International Airport was kept for prying eyes. Other employees who were not directly involved with the X-15 were actually blocked out by this fence you see here around the aircraft. They couldn't see it. Until 15 October 1958, just 2 weeks after NASA was formed, the X-15 was unveiled to the public and all that classification disappeared. Vice President Nixon said that day, the X-15 is exciting because of the fact that it is designed to carry man into space for the first time. It's an integral part of an orderly and reasoned space program. These pilots are men to be envied, for theirs will be the ultimate goal toward which men's dreams have stretched for centuries. It is useless for me to cite their bravery. We can only envy them for the opportunity which is theirs. Now, an integral part of the X-15 was the Mc2 pressure suit, seen here worn by Scott Crossfield in a heat transfer facility. It came from the David Clark Company, which had previously specialized in the manufacture of women's undergarments. Crossfield once wrote, "The structural loads imposed on a girdle, as we all know, can be tremendous, and a machine which can build a good one automatically is an amazing engineering accomplishment." With his ingenious machine, Clark had all but cornered the important, shall we say, expanding girdle market. Braving new frontiers, Clark then moved into the manufacture of brassieres, which, considering those structural loads, was even more awesome. This then gave the David Clark Company the proper foundation on which to build America's first spacesuits. Now, the cockpit was a very tight fit, as you can see in this fisheye view from right beside Scott Crossfield. And they prepared for months for the first flight, but problems kept the X-15 in the hangar or attached to the B-52 mothership, where it was repeatedly fueled and checked out. Finally, on Monday, 8 June 1959, the X-15 achieved its first flight, dropping away from the B-52's wing at 8:38 a.m. Scotty expertly glided the unpowered X-15 towards the Rogers Dry Lake bed at Edwards Air Force Base in California's Mojave Desert. As he neared landing, Scotty experienced a near disastrous pilot-induced oscillation, but he was able to expertly touch down at the bottom of one of these oscillations, and the first flight was a success. Scotty had microphones in his face before he could leave the cockpit. At the time of this flight, everyone thought the X-15 would be the vehicle to put the first man into space. The second X-15 soon joined the fleet, making the first powered flight on 17 September 1959. Rocket engine development, however, was behind schedule, so the XLR-11 rockets were installed. These are the same which had powered Chuck Yeager and the X-1 to the first supersonic flight in 1947. Those LR-11s worked perfectly. Touchdown of the first powered flight. The third powered flight, however, did not go quite so well, as you can see here. A fire in the engine compartment right after engine ignition and an overweight landing broke the back on X-15 number 2 the moment it touched down. But the number 1 was there to continue flight testing, while number 2 was sent back to North American to be repaired. And while the initial flight tests continued, the third X-15 was being prepped for the 60,000-pound thrust XLR-99 rocket engine, which is what the design was for the X-15 in the first place. Now, here at the propulsion system test facility, they could test fire 2 X-15s. You can see the 2 different test stands there. But what I want you to notice is up in the upper left corner, Scott Crossfield's little red and white Beechcraft Bonanza that is parked close by. Scott's daughter Sally told me in the X-15 days he started flying his Bonanza to and from Edwards because we had moved from Lancaster down to Los Angeles. So him flying back and forth was the only way that he could get any home time with us. The powers that be at North American, though, didn't like him flying his personal plane because they thought it was too dangerous. How's that for ironic for a rocket plane pilot? Now, this is what a successful LR-99 engine firing should look like in the test stand. But on 8 June 1960, it did not go quite as planned. A valve stuck, causing a fuel explosion, literally blowing the X-15 in half. Scotty in the forward section of the X-15 shot forward 25 feet, but he did not suffer any major injury. After being hosed down by the firemen, Scotty famously said the headline that day should read, "Aircraft blows up, pilot wets pants." Now here's one of the only photos showing the first 4 pilots. Forrest Peterson from the Navy, Scott Crossfield from North American, Robert White from the Air Force, who had taken over from Ivan Kinchlow, who was killed in an accident prior to the X-15 starting flight testing, and Joe Walker from NASA. Now you can see Forrest Peterson of the Navy was often left out in these publicity shots. They were sort of the also-ran of the program. Now, Scotty finally had to leave. He at one time proposed actually flying every single mission of the X-15. The Air Force, who was footing the bill, and NASA, who was running the program, said, no, finish the flight test program we planned on, we agreed to, and let's get going here. So it's time for you to move on. So here, Bob White symbolically takes the keys from Scott, while Neil Armstrong of NASA looks on. They were definitely anxious to get moving on this program. Now here's a typical mission profile for an X-15. The X-15 was the first experimental aircraft to leave the local area at Edwards Air Force Base. It required a 400-mile-long corridor known as the High Range, with 2 tracking stations that followed every flight. From Beatty, Nevada, just east of Death Valley, all the way up to Ely, near the northeastern corner of Nevada, 9,300 feet up in the mountains, where, as you can see by this photo, it can get a bit cold at times. Now here's a group shot of the first batch of X-15 pilots, primary and backup. On the bookends, we have Robert Rushworth at the nose of the X-15, who was the backup pilot for the Air Force for Bob White on the far right. And then we've got Jack McKay from NASA, who is the backup pilot to Joe Walker, who's near the center, next to Neil Armstrong, who's the secondary backup pilot for NASA. And in the very center, Forrest Peterson from the Navy, who did not have a backup pilot. They were the only program participants with a single pilot. So first up after Scotty was Joe Walker. He was a relaxed old country boy from the backwoods of Pennsylvania. And here he is stepping out of the suiting van and heading for the X-15 and dropping away on the first NASA flight on 25 March of 1960. Notice that NASA wasted no time in emblazoning their bright yellow logo on the rocket plane's tail. They wanted the world to know who was in charge of the X-15. Now also remember that the X-15 is flying in the early, late 1960s. This is the same time we were flying Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, working our way to the moon. So compare the recovery operations of the X-15 with a few people, a few vehicles out on the Edwards Lake bed to what was going on with those other vehicles where you needed an entire naval flotilla to recover the astronauts who came back from a flight. Now, Joe Walker took the X-15 to the heights. On 22 August 1963, Walker topped out the program at 354,200 feet. That's 67.1 miles. That's about 10 times higher than your average commercial airliner. And with no air, attitude control jets, as seen here in this image, were required to keep the rocket plane properly oriented before a human-controlled re-entry. And here's the curvature of the Earth as seen by the pilots of the X-15. Joe Walker's eloquent perspective of this flight, he said, the overhead aspect is just like one of these dark velvet cloths as far as the sky's appearance, but there weren't any specks of light shining through that I could pick out. He remarked, by gosh, it's dark up here today, quite a different view. What a beautiful day it is. It can probably be stated that of the 12 X-15 pilots, Joe appeared to enjoy the ride more than anyone else. He said, you got a long time to where you find yourself having done your looking around and figuring, well, if I'd had a better sense, I would have looked around even more. Joe completed his stint on the X-15 and left to become NASA's chief pilot on the XB-70A Valkyrie bomber. On 8 June 1966, Walker was flying an F-104 as part of a 5-aircraft formation centered on the B-70. His F-104, seen here below the B-70 with the orange tail, slid in tight for this photography, and it was caught in the wingtip vortex of the giant bomber. The F-104 flipped over the top of the B-70, rolled across, and fell off the back. A frantic call of Mayday, Mayday, Mayday went out over the air. Walker was killed instantly as the F-104 broke into 3 pieces. The B-70 was crippled and went down minutes later, killing co-pilot Carl Cross. But B-70 pilot Al White, who had been cross-field backup on the X-15, did survive, although he had severe injuries. Now, the prime pilot for the Air Force was Bob White, seen here with Joe Walker while he was still flying the program. These 2 guys were the primary X-15 record setters. Now, White prepares for the drop in a very short 10-minute rocket flight to come. That's all it was. Once you dropped off the wing of the B-52, you had about 10 minutes before you were going to be on the ground. That was it. You can see in this photo his white helmet there. He's looking at the switch positions, getting ready for his drop. Now, Bob White was the only man to be the first to surpass 3 Mach numbers. Everybody knows Chuck Yeager, Mach 1, and Scott Crossfield was Mach 2. Mel Apt was the first to break Mach 3, and he lost his life doing so. Bob White broke 3 Mach numbers, and yet very few people know of him today. Bob told me, you know, I didn't realize until afterward that I was the first Mach 4, 5, and 6. Now, some NASA guy had come up to me and said, hey, wait a minute, we want Joe Walker to break one of these here too. Well, I'm not quite sure what would have happened. The Air Force did love to set their records. Now, White was so proud of his skills as an X-15 pilot, so much so that he bet a martini to his best buddy on the program, Doug Day, that he could set the rocket plane down within just 1,000 feet of the planned touchdown point. Now, that's not too bad when you consider he's gliding back from suborbital space using 1950s vintage analog equipment, and he won his bet on nearly every one of his 16 flights. Bob really loved those martinis. And after becoming the first pilot to exceed 300,000 feet on 17 July 1962, White had to get out quick and catch a flight to head back to Washington, D.C., where he was to receive the Collier Trophy with fellow pilots Crossfield, Walker, and Peterson. President John F. Kennedy that day said, "We're very proud of these 4 young men who are among the finest we have, who took a manned aircraft into space yesterday to over 300,000 feet and over 4,000 miles per hour. We're very proud to have them here, not only for what they have done in space, but also because they represent the kind of Americans whom we want this country to be identified with. We hope that their example will encourage others to do something that requires reaching beyond what we now know and what we now do." Now, here's a comparison of the LR-11 and LR-99 engines. It took 2 of the 4-chambered LR-11s stacked on top of each other to achieve 16,000 pounds of thrust for the X-15, whereas the LR-99 punched in with 60,000 pounds of thrust in a package just 6 feet long with 1 single chamber. It was also the very first throttleable rocket engine. Here's the twin LR-11s firing at the test stand as configured for the X-15, and the X-15 under power with the twin LR-11s. Maximum speed achieved was Mach 3.5, half of that envisioned for the LR-99. And here's the very impressive single-chamber LR-99 firing on the test stand and installed in an X-15, ready for flight. As I mentioned previously, Forrest Peterson was the only U.S. Navy pilot on the program. While serving on the X-15, he was up for promotion, but to get that in the Navy required sea duty. That's hard to come by while you're assigned to a base out in the desert. But a way was found around this requirement by assigning him to a naval squadron just north of Edwards at the China Lake Naval Ordnance Test Station. Peterson said, "All they did was assign me to that squadron up at China Lake, yet I stayed at the same office at Edwards where I'd always been." China Lake was just as landlocked as Rogers Dry Lake was, but that didn't matter. After a year, I accumulated my sea duty, and they promoted me to commander. On 10 January 1962, Peterson made his final flight in the program, which also turned out to be the first emergency landing outside of Edwards Air Force Base. After landing safely at Mud Dry Lake near Tonopah, Nevada, the X-15 had to be trucked about 200 miles overland back to Edwards Air Force Base. It's a long trip, so you always got to stop and get some gas and a snack on the way home, as you can see here when they made a stop in Beatty, Nevada. Now, Peterson had to leave the X-15 to resume his naval career, which included commanding the aircraft carrier, the USS Enterprise. I guess you could say he was the original Captain Kirk. Now, Jack McKay is seen here with his wife Shirley and first daughter Sherry, who came aboard as the second NASA X-15 pilot. And strapped to the mothership's wing, McKay heads for the launch altitude the morning of 9 November 1962. Things did not go so well, as I read to you in an excerpt from Chapter 5 at the beginning of this talk. This is what the aftermath of that accident looked like on Mud Lake. The shadow of the H-21 helicopter is seen hovering above the crippled and upside down X-15 number 2. McKay has already been dug out and is on his way to the hospital, where he would spend over 4 months. Operation engineer Bill Albrecht told me, Jack McKay saved his own life. As soon as he saw it was going to tumble over, he jettisoned the canopy. He was smart enough to think, if I go over and I'm not breathing air, by the time they get here to rescue me, I'll be dead. Now you can see the massive damage to the X-15. Who would not expect this to be a total loss? It's amazing that McKay even survived. Bill continued saying, my first view of it was from the window of the C-47 Goonie Bird, which took a bunch of us up to Mud Lake to prepare the X-15 to come back to Edwards. When I saw that thing upside down, I said, that is the end of that airplane. But a steel airplane is something else. It's tough stuff. The X-15 was not built out of aluminum like you might assume. This was Inconel X alloy steel that was used. Very tough, very heavy. And although severely injured, McKay returned to the program and accomplished 22 more X-15 research flights, although he did experience 2 more emergency landings before finally leaving the program in September of 1966. Now, McKay was a family man with 8 children, seen here with 2 of them up at Red Rock Canyon near Edwards. In the end, those injuries shortened his life, and he died in 1975. His daughter Sherry told me, most of the time when there's an accident with a test pilot, they are killed outright. They aren't hanging around in the halls at Edwards as a reminder of what might happen to them. I think my father felt alienated from everyone and everything, and he was in a tremendous amount of pain. Bob Rushworth was up next, and he became the most successful X-15 pilot of the 12, accomplishing 34 flights in less than 6 years. Paul Bickle, the head of the X-15 program, related to me what Bob White rushed into his office to say about Rushworth. He said, Bob's not motivated enough. We asked if he wanted to get on the X-15 program. He said he had to think about it for a week. He even had to ask his wife. Can you imagine? John Perry, the engineer in charge of the X-15 flight simulator, related to me that it was not a good idea for Bob White to get on Bickle's bad side. If we misjudged something, Bickle was not at all reluctant to tell you so. So we used to say, if you messed up, you're going to be in the Bickle barrel. Now, as you can see by this photo, the F-104 and X-15 are very similar in shape and size. The F-104 was the perfect way for the X-15 pilots to practice their landings, something Rushworth did hundreds of times during the program. Now, after the McKay accident in 1962, remember that mess you saw on Mud Lake? Well, they rebuilt it. This tough steel airplane was rebuilt into what is now called the X-15A2. The fuselage has actually been lengthened 29 inches. The most visible thing was the fact they added 2 external fuel tanks, one for oxidizer and for fuel, which extended the range on the LR-99 firing by an extra 60 seconds. And with those external tanks in place, this updated version could really push the edge of what the X-15 was capable of doing. They were shooting for up to Mach 8. Now, like the solid rocket boosters on the space shuttle, the tanks would be jettisoned at Mach 2. On Rushworth's last flight, it was the first with full fuel tanks. El cheapo transducers, as flight planner Johnny Armstrong told me, misread the fuel flow, and the tanks were erroneously jettisoned. Another emergency landing back to Mud Lake. And here we are in the middle of the program, another group shot. We've got Jack McKay, who is about to take over the prime spot from Joe Walker. This is toward the end of his time on the X-15. And the new backup pilot for McKay will now be Milt Thompson there in the middle, and Robert Rushworth, who's now the prime X-15 pilot for the Air Force, and his backup, Joe Engle. And I'm very proud Joe Engle is also the one who wrote the foreword for my book, The X-15 Rocket Plane. He's also, unfortunately, the only one of the 12 pilots who is still with us today. Not shown in that photo is Neil Armstrong, who became the 7th X-15 pilot. I always love this picture. He looks so young. This is like Daddy Take Me to Work Day or something. It was so sad to lose Neil so many years ago now. Now here's Armstrong with a couple of X-15 engineers, John McTeague and Elmore Adkins. They're just below the X-15. The nose gear of the X-15 is right behind Neil's head there. It hasn't been stowed for flight. It's hanging from the B-52. And here's Neil leaving the suiting van and heading out to the rocket plane to get on board and ready for flight. And here he is ready to drop. Roger Barnicky, who worked on the life support systems, in other words, the pressure suit that kept these guys alive, he said, I watched them get ready for a flight and come back and just have the biggest grin on their faces. They were doing something they loved, and it really showed how much they enjoyed flying. This was their life. There wasn't one of them that didn't give me that impression. So, of course, I had to ask Roger, what if something screwed up in the airplane that was the pilot's fault? Well, then they were kind of quiet, but they didn't hide things. That was dangerous. And Neil screwed up on several occasions, such as a flight where he skipped back up out of the atmosphere in the X-15, or almost crashing his F-104 while checking out a dry lake bed for an upcoming X-15 flight by not judging his altitude correctly. Here's a view of that scene. Paul Bickle described this scene to me, saying, Neil realized what he'd done, so he firewalled the F-104. But while the engine was picking up speed, the ship kept getting lower and lower. He dragged one tip tank off and dragged the ventral off the tail, which released the arrestor hook back there. It also tore out one of the hydraulic systems and the radio antenna, which left him without any radio, only emergency hydraulics and red lights flashing all over the place. If you know the F-104, the landing gear comes down from the center and pushes outward. Here they're measuring to see just how close the F-104 came to crashing into the lake bed. This is how far up the landing gear was pushed back into the F-104. Continuing, Bickle said, he knew he had problems, but he didn't know what, so he figured he'd make a flaps-up landing at Nellis Air Force Base near Las Vegas. But this hook is hanging out the back. He snagged that arresting chain across the approach end of the runway at 220 knots, just tore the chain out of the runway. His airplane went down the runway, dragging all this junk, and blew the tires. Nellis was tied up for 3 hours just getting the runway cleared off. Then Milt Thompson went up in a two-place F-104B to bring Neil back home. He overshot the runway, blew his tires off, and tied the thing up again. The aerodrome officer at Nellis called me and said, hey, you guys, please don't send any more airplanes up here. We'll load all your guys into one of ours and bring them back to you. A disgraceful display all around. After that, Neil left for Houston, and the rest is history. Now, early in Joe Engle's career, he got to serve as a docent during a visit from Vice President Hubert Humphrey. I was the new guy on the program, and Bob Rushworth said, "You're going to go down to the hangar and stand by the X-15. Just stand there. You don't have to say anything." Well, Humphrey came up to me and he said, "Well, what have we here?" Scared the hell out of me. I didn't know how to talk to a guy like that. But Joe recovered quickly. He replied to Humphrey, "Well, it's the X-15, sir." The vice president thought a moment, then said, "Oh, yes, yes. Now, how many squadrons of these do we have?" Ingle wasn't quite sure what to say, but he replied, "Well, not very many, sir." Humphrey said, "Well, obviously we need more of these. I'll fix that when I get back to Washington." Now, Ingle went on to fly 3 astronaut qualification flights in the X-15, seeing the Earth from more than 280,000 feet above the Southwest, as seen here. The bottom center is Las Vegas, Nevada, and up to the upper left is Lake Mead. And here's a dramatic reentry as seen from suborbital space. Throughout this presentation, you've seen several images like this. These were all created by this amazing artist, Tommy Erickson. He's from Gothenburg, Sweden. And we worked together for like 6 years to get these images for the book. And he just did an absolutely fantastic job. Can't thank Tommy enough for all of his great work. Now, many others were excited about the X-15. Even as astronauts prepared to fly to the moon, Werner von Braun, the architect of Apollo, came to Edwards and wanted to know what it would be like to fly a winged craft into space. And here's Miss Edwards, 1962, Wanda Capps, who gets a lift from the wing of the X-15. And how about the cast and crew from the TV show Star Trek, who beamed down to Edwards to check out the real deal? Now, the X-15 is often considered a man's program, but it should never be forgotten that many women worked on it as well. They were called computers, and they took all the data and plotted it out for the engineers using calculators, paper, and pens. Without the women, the X-15 data meant nothing. Now, like Neil, Joe left for Houston and was initially assigned as the lunar module pilot for Apollo 17, the 6th lunar landing. Unfortunately, he got replaced on the flight by Harrison Smith because they wanted to put a geologist on the moon, and so he lost his chance to walk on the surface of the moon. But after getting bumped from Apollo, Joe finally stayed with the program and flew 2 missions more into space, commanding the space shuttle in 1981 with STS-2 and STS-51I in 1985. Joe is the only astronaut in history who earned his astronaut wings prior to going into orbit because of his 3 X-15 astronaut qualification flights. Now, Milt Thompson was a man torn between 2 flight test programs. He also got to be NASA's technical advisor on the very first movie ever filmed in space. Milt recalled being involved for approximately 3 months on this movie. I mean, here it is, actually filmed in space. Hollywood would never steer us wrong, right? Milt said, "I think they were here on site probably a couple of months, and after that, we went down and spent a month in Hollywood during the cutting process." Did he have any input on how to make the film better? Oh yeah, a lot of stuff. It was completely wrong on many things. They really didn't understand airplanes at all. The guy that wrote the script had apparently never even been around an airplane. Charles Bronson as an X-15 pilot, seen here with real pilot Bob White, and Mary Tyler Moore in her first big screen debut, showing us the proper attire to be out around experimental aircraft with high heels on the lake bed. But the hype didn't end there. Here's a couple scenes from the movie Battle in Outer Space, where those squadrons of X-15s that Hubert Humphrey ordered got put into service battling aliens. They had gantry launched, silo launched, silver X-15s with red racing stripes. These were great planes. And what X-15 would not be complete without a death ray in its nose? Now, people forget how popular the X-15 was at the time. it was used to advertise a company's participation in the high-flying program, or maybe to just get your attention by calling your product, in this case, the Kodak Instamatic X-15. And yes, there is a camera in that photograph. Now, besides film and advertising, there were many books, fiction and nonfiction, including these, The Fictional Adventures for Young Readers of Mike Mars. Love this. Two of the books in that series devoted to the X-15. And there's a really cool X-15 runaround friction toy. And it shows how popular the X-15 is even today. Even I didn't buy this thing. It went for over $900 on eBay several years ago. And in 2006, the US Post Office issued 2 X-15 stamps, which also happened to be holograms, which is pretty cool. Now, after 14 flights and a chance at Hollywood, Thompson finished on the X-15 program. He said, "It was busy on the altitude flights. I really only got a chance to look out the window once, and that was my last flight. I got up on top after I had everything fairly settled, then looked out the window. Gee, it was a really impressive view. You could see all the way from San Francisco to Baja, California. It was beautiful up there, but you just have a few precious seconds to take a look." Now, Milt was the first to fly the lifting body type, and he had to make the choice of one program or the other. Bickle said, "You got too much going on," and contrary to what you might think, he went on with the lifting body program over the X-15. The M2 F2 lifting body shown behind him, that was made famous in the opening of The $6 Million Man, if you recall that program. Now, Pete Knight was about to become the fastest man alive. His program was the X-15A2 with the external fuel tanks, which he inherited from Bob Rushworth when he retired from the program. Now, Pete made 16 flights on the X-15. One of them is considered the most famous, while another was one of the most dangerous. The program built up speed, testing out the capabilities of the external fuel tanks. But one primary purpose of the high-speed flights was also to test a scramjet engine, as you can see mounted to the lower ventral of the X-15 here. After years of work, this engine never came to fruition during the X-15 program and has only recently been tested using unmanned vehicles at hypersonic velocity. But they did several flights with this dummy version of the scramjet, just testing out the aerodynamics. But before continuing with the A2, on a routine flight in aircraft number 1, Pete launched, and soon afterward, all electrical power in the plane died. No one knew where he was, or even if he was still alive. Knight told me, "I was a little over Mach 4, and the airplane was wallowing around. I still had reaction jets, so I maintained some control. At one time, I was up about a 70-degree bank angle. I looked down, I saw Mono Lake below me, and I told myself, you better enjoy that view, because that's the last one you're going to see." My thoughts were that this was going to hurt regardless of what I did. If I bailed out, I was over Mach 4. That's the limit on the jettison seat. So I thought, well, I'll stay with it. I'll see what happens. I'll see how long I can control it. Once I lose it, well, then I'll bail out. As the aircraft went over the top, I started an auxiliary power unit, and that gave me hydraulics to control the reentry. I didn't have any instruments, and there were no lights in the cockpit. As I entered the atmosphere, I turned around, pulled about 6 Gs to get back to Mud Lake. I didn't have any flaps. All I had was airspeed and altitude once I went subsonic. Knight landed safely, but it took a while to find him sitting out on Mud Lake. Once they finally arrived, Pete was flown back to Edwards, and the X-15 was made ready for yet another convoy back to base. Now, made to protect the X-15A2 and its pilots at speeds of up to Mach 8, this Martin ablator that they sprayed on had the consistency of a pencil eraser, along with, as you can see here, the color. But this ablator was oxygen sensitive, meaning that if oxygen soaked into the ablator, And if something struck the ablative, such as a technician with a wrench or something, it could literally explode. Not to mention, as Knight explained very emphatically to me, it was pink. I'm not flying a pink airplane. So a white paint layer was added atop the pink, and Pete then felt it was safe enough to come near the X-15 again. And here, North American Aviation's two white beauties, the XB-70A Valkyrie bomber and the X-15A2 rocket plane, which had now been nicknamed in honor of its pilot, the White Knight. It was 2:31 in the afternoon of 3 October 1967 when Pete dropped away from the B-52 with a fully loaded, ablative-covered X-15A2. He leveled off at 102,100 feet and made his speed run, topping out at Mach 6.70, 4,520 miles per hour. Unbeknownst to him, the aircraft was in peril as shock waves burned through the X-15 skin coming off of that scramjet mounted on the lower ventral. After landing, the damage was clear. They had almost lost the X-15. This aircraft would never fly again. As for surviving those high-speed flights, Knight was awarded the Harmon Trophy by President Lyndon Johnson. Now, Bill Dana was the last of the NASA pilots to come onto the program, and he found, as the other people did on the program, that the best way to get used to flying at Mach 6 and 300,000 feet was to sit in the hangar and fly what they called the Iron Bird, the X-15 simulator, usually drinking a cup of coffee and talking with your friends. And inside the hangar, here you can see 3 X-15s off on the right. On the left, you see the lifting bodies, the HL-10, M2F2, M2F1, some other vehicles there, bright day-glow orange Skyray in the back that was used for the X-20 program. This is a far cry from the mundane view inside that same hangar today. This is the view I saw as a kid. This is what got me excited about the X-15 program and led to writing the book eventually many years later. Now here we have a shot of Dana the day before his first X-15 flight. He has an unexplained Band-Aid on his nose. He refused to tell me what caused that small injury. Don't know if he got into an altercation with the simulator or what that might have been. Now, by this time in the program, the X-15 carried experiments rather than being the experiment itself. This image shows the X-15 as it has never been seen, working in space with instruments deployed. Solar spectrum, missile launch signature detection, high altitude balloon deployment, or Bill's favorite, I say this a little sarcastically, collecting micrometeorite dust. Dana said, I remember there was this big meteor shower, and to get out here to Edwards for that early flight, I had to drive to work in the dark. I have never ever seen so many shooting stars in my life. There must have been 1,000 of them as I came in from Lancaster. And those were the micrometeorites we were going to try to capture. I always thought what a classically dumb idea it was in the first place. So of course I asked him what of the possibility of capturing one through the X-15 cockpit rather than the experiment on the left wingtip pod seen with the doors open out there. Bill stated hopefully, well, I don't suppose it would have hurt us. Well, Bill did survive his high altitude experiment flights, just fine. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for the 12th and final X-15 pilot, Michael J. Adams from the United States Air Force. After being accepted as an astronaut in the Manned Orbiting Laboratory program, he saw the writing on the wall that they were never going to get this off the launch pad. So he asked for and was transferred to the X-15, where he flew 6 successful missions until the morning of 15 November 1967, less than 6 weeks after the high-speed flight of Pete Knight. Launching at 10:30 a.m., Mike headed upward into space, topping out at 266,000 feet, earning him a set of astronaut wings. But electrical problems distracted him. At the top of his arc, he misread an instrument and actually turned the X-15 backwards along its flight path for re-entry. As the air bit into the rocket plane, the orientation sent him into a hypersonic spin, knocking him out, something which has never occurred before or since in the history of aviation. Mike came to long enough to grab the controls, but the aircraft went into a severe up and down porpoising motion, which exceeded the structural limits of the aircraft, breaking the X-15 apart. Near Ridgecrest, the remains of X-15 number 3 crashed into the desert at 10:35 a.m., just 5 minutes after he left the wing of the B-52. Bob White said, "I often felt that sometimes we went too far with these things. When I was participating in the program, your eye was always on the ball. It was very intense. Now you're starting to take this as a routine thing." Boy, this is not routine stuff. That NASA is a different NASA than the one that I operated with. A memorial created by Eagle Scout John Badelsky now marks the spot in the desert where Mike Adams lost his life, and it has been greatly expanded over the years. It's an amazing place to visit if you ever get out to the California desert. After the accident, the X-15 was flown by Knight and Dana 8 more times in the coming year, after coming to a close with the final flight on 24 October of 1968. With a total of 199 flights, the hope had been to make it a nice, round, even 200 before the end of the fiscal year. The last of the 8 attempts was made on 20 December. With all systems operational, Pete Knight was near the X-15, ready to board the B-52 for the takeoff roll. The clouds opened up with a freak snowstorm, and Paul Bickle said, "We're aborting this flight. Somebody is trying to tell us something." The X-15 program was officially completed. The number 1 X-15 was shipped off to the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., and number 2 went to the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio. Here, 7 of the pilots celebrate the X-15 at the Smithsonian soon after it arrived. The X-15 created 8 new astronauts, 5 from the Air Force and 3 from NASA. The Air Force took care of their own at the time that it happened, but it took until 2005 before NASA finally recognized the achievements of Joe Walker, Jack McKay, and Bill Dana. Bill was the only one still alive to receive his wings that day. What could have come next? A possible Delta wing variant, but that disappeared after the Adams accident, since the number 3 had been slated for that program. Or maybe a scramjet-powered model, the true follow-on to the X-15, something which has never materialized in the more than half a century since the program was completed. No manned X-plane may ever again achieve what the X-15 accomplished. No more testing our limits, no new frontiers to achieve. I hope that maybe the story of the X-15 that I've told you here today, and about the people who made it happen, may instead inspire a new generation to take flight in a quest for the unknown. The pilots of the X-15 and I bid you farewell and a good day. Thank you so much for having me here at Aerospace 2021 in Valencia. And I hope that we are able to have some sort of a question and answer period with this as well. Thank you so much for the invite. Appreciate being here. Take care.